Hi, it's Katrina.
The Corpse Collector. A Russian historian was caught after robbing the graves of 29 young girls and then taking their corpses home, where he turned the bodies into dolls. Anatoly Moskvin, 53, also expressed no remorse about his activities and refused to apologize to the parents of the deceased girls, claiming, "You left them in the cold. I took them home to keep them warm." The mummified remains of the girls were covered in masks, and he dressed them and applied makeup to them as well. One of the stranger aspects of this case, and there are obviously many, Moskvin actually shared his home with his parents. His parents told authorities they had absolutely no idea that he was collecting bodies and turning them into giant dolls. They just thought the large dolls were part of an unusual hobby. During the days of the Soviet Union, Moskvin worked as a translator for military intelligence. He went on after the collapse of the Soviet Union to write history books. He had a deep comprehension of biology and apparently of cemeteries. Over the years, he dug up many corpses, brought them home, dressed them in clothing, and kept them preserved in his own house. He even celebrated their birthdays with macabre parties. The Corpse Collector was captured in 2011 when he confessed to 44 counts of abusing graves. He was moved to a mental institution, and as recently as 2020, there were discussions of releasing him as his schizophrenia was reportedly cured. The judge in the case overturned the appeal, and he remains in custody. The Soapy Killer. The Italian serial killer Leonarda Cianciulli was born in 1894. She got married in the 1930s, opened up a little shop in the small town of Correggio, and started selling soap. Leonarda's shop may have been doing all right, but the rest of her life at the time was filled with strife. She served a short jail sentence for committing fraud, her home was destroyed in an earthquake, and she was constantly battling with her parents about her marriage, which they didn't approve of. Not only that, but Leonarda was experiencing major fertility issues. She'd been pregnant 17 times, but of the 17 children, 3 died due to miscarriage, and 10 died during early childhood. She became incredibly superstitious about her children, and also became more deeply interested in fortune-telling, palm reading, and tarot, a childhood interest of hers. It was during a meeting with another fortune teller who predicted her remaining 4 children would also die that she was told that the only way to prevent her still living children from dying was to start sacrificing people. Leonarda was frightened, but she didn't start the human sacrifices right away. However, in 1939, her son told her he was joining the military. This pushed Leonarda into action, and she began luring women back to her soap shop and killing them in an effort to keep her surviving children safe. How did she kill these women, and what did she do with them? That's the true horror of it. She first tricked the women into going into her shop by promising to tell their fortune or offering to help them find whatever they were looking for, including telling one victim she could help them find a husband. She drugged her victims with spiked wine, then she killed each woman with an axe and boiled their body in caustic soda. She then used her victims' flesh and fat to make soap that she sold in her store. She gave these bars of soap to her neighbors, her friends, and anyone who would pay for them. She also used some of her victims' fat to make cakes, which she ate. But her killing spree ended after just the 3rd victim. A witness saw the victim going into her soap shop and then never coming out. When police went to investigate, she confessed everything and was arrested. Food for workers. In the United Arab Emirates, a Moroccan woman went seriously off the deep end. Back in 2018, she suffered a fit of insanity in which she killed her boyfriend of 7 years and then cooked him. According to a report from the BBC, her boyfriend had been planning on leaving her. He was actually planning to marry a different woman from Morocco, and this naturally upset the unnamed killer. Feeling like a thrown-away piece of trash, she murdered her boyfriend, cut him into pieces, ground up his flesh in a blender, and turned him into a traditional Moroccan dish with rice and vegetables. She then took the dish to some nearby Pakistani construction workers and watched them eat it. This part of the killing goes beyond unwarranted. The construction workers were made to eat a person without their knowledge and were likely completely horrified. Why she went to this extent of horror is beyond understanding. It was the murdered boyfriend's brother who ended up solving the case. When he went looking for his missing sibling, he found a single tooth sitting in a blender in the woman's house. He phoned the police, DNA tests confirmed the tooth belonged to the victim, and she broke down and confessed. Last we heard, she was sent to a mental hospital. Ed Gein's furniture of horror. When it comes to killers who made a career out of crafting things from the remains of their victims, Ed Gein holds the title of most creative. When the authorities raided Ed's house back in the 1950s, they found so much horror that it's hard to even describe. Ed had a fascination with decapitation, necrophilia, and arts and crafts. He started out as a fairly ordinary resident of Plainfield, Wisconsin, but when his mother died, he really went off the rails. He had been oddly obsessed with his mother and didn't seem able to process the fact that she was gone. In the mid-1950s, when Ed was alone and confused, residents of Plainfield began going missing. By 1957, the police had linked Ed to both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, both of whom had vanished. When the police went into Ed's house, they found suits, lampshades, and chairs made from human skin, masks made from people's faces, a belt crafted of human nipples, and several human organs stuffed into jars. Not only had Ed been killing multiple local women, he had also been digging up graves at the nearby cemetery, using the bodies of the recently deceased in his arts and crafts experiments. The man who is credited as being the inspiration for the killer Buffalo Bill in the movie Silence of the Lambs was later found guilty of murder and criminally insane. He died in captivity in 1984. Old Lady Killer. Ed Gein may have been one of the most notorious serial murderers, but Juana Barraza Samperio is a criminal mastermind. She is currently spending the rest of her days locked up in the Santa Marta de Acatitla prison in Mexico. The reason for her incarceration? She killed at least 48 people. She's known as the Little Old Lady Killer. When still living on the outside, she spent her days selling popcorn and occasionally fighting in wrestling matches. The rest of her time, she was hunting and killing elderly women. According to the Mexican authorities, Juana killed nearly 50 people in Mexico City between the 1990s and January 25, 2006. She only got caught when a neighbor witnessed her leaving the scene of a crime. Although the cops couldn't get evidence for every murder, they did manage to pin her in 17 of them. These 17 murders alone earned her 759 years in jail. During her trial, it came out that Juana was a psychopath incapable of feeling remorse. She actually thought she was helping society by getting rid of elderly women, likely because of the trauma she experienced in her own childhood. When Juana was just a young girl, her mother would trade her to dangerous men for things like beer and cash. When she grew up, she took that hate of her mother and transformed it into something evil, lashing out at older women, perhaps because they reminded her of her mother. And now for a serial killer Santa. But first, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We have more true crime coming soon. Serial killing Santa. Bruce MacArthur was seen on the outside as a happy man. Those that knew him described him as outgoing, friendly, and even jovial. He had white hair, a white beard, and played the perfect Santa Claus at the Agincourt Mall in Toronto as recently as 2016. He was a 66-year-old landscaper who posed as Santa during the holidays, and it seemed that he loved children. What no one knew was that Bruce had a bizarre attraction to the dead. Not only did he have an obsession with dead bodies, but he was also a serial killer. As a landscaper, Bruce used his cover to bury the bodies of his victims in his customers' gardens. While his clients thought he was simply creating beautiful landscapes, he was actually turning them into secret graveyards. Between 2010 and 2017, Bruce MacArthur murdered 8 men that we know of. His targets were the homeless, the destitute, and immigrants in the predominantly gay neighborhood of Church and Wellesley. Bruce's method of killing is what will really give you chills. Strangulation was his preferred method. He would wrap a rope around his victim's throat, then use a metal bar to tighten the ligature. Once his victim had stopped breathing, Bruce would then do a photo shoot. He would dress up his victims in things like fur coats, sometimes positioning them as if still alive, with one victim even photographed with a cigar hanging out of his mouth. When Bruce was finally caught by the police, authorities in Toronto had to check out 75 properties in search of remains. Bruce had concealed many victims in the planters and gardens he had worked on as a landscaper. How do you think you'd react if the police told you they needed to inspect your yard for human remains? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. The Torso Murders. From 1935 to 1938, between 12 and 13 bodies were found dumped in Cleveland's Kingsbury Run. The area is a creek bed that runs through the city down to the Cuyahoga River. The victims included at least 7 men and 5 women, most of whom were unhoused or sex workers. These unfortunate people were living far below the poverty line in the days when Cleveland was still suffering from the impacts of the Great Depression. Most of the individuals weren't reported missing for months after their disappearances, sometimes not even until their bodies were found. What makes these murders especially disturbing was the fact that every single body was found without a head or limbs. The only parts of the remains that turned up were the torsos of the victims. After over 80 years, this is still the most gruesome crime spree in the history of Cleveland. The killer is known today as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and believe it or not, he or she has never been identified by the police. The killings only stopped when the killer presumably lost interest, moved, or died. Even years after the torsos stopped turning up, authorities still were unable to locate all the heads. To this day, no one knows what the Mad Butcher did with the heads and the limbs of their victims. The Bone Collector. In Mexico, authorities recently discovered approximately 3,787 bone fragments that they say belong to at least 17 different murder victims. The killer in this story was a bone collector. He had a fascination with killing and dismembering. The Mexican authorities have not been able to release his identity, but they do say that by the time they caught up to him, he was 72 years old. The cops actually arrested this serial murderer in connection with the killing of a 34-year-old woman whom he reportedly cut up with a hacksaw. It was when they began looking at his home that they discovered the true scope of his crimes. During careful excavations, the police found the bones and bone fragments, as well as 91 photographs, 8 cell phones, a bucket full of women's jewelry, and actual videotape of the man murdering his victims. He had been dismembering his victims, cutting them up so small that he had pieces of them hidden all throughout his house. The police were shocked and horrified when they realized the extent of the crime scene. As of right now, the police are still trying to extract DNA from the bone fragments to identify the victims, many of which are probably missing people. In the meantime, the identity of this prolific serial murderer has still not been released. Human burgers. Joe Metheny, much like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy, was a truly gruesome killer. But for some strange reason, despite the horror of his crimes, he is not as well known. If you're one of those people who haven't heard of him, get ready to be shocked. Joe was arrested in Baltimore back in December of 1996. At the time, police knew he was responsible for at least 3 murders. But after he was convicted of these murders, he finally spilled the beans that he killed at least 10 people. He also admitted that he was a cannibal, and that he served his victims to unsuspecting patrons of his burger stand. He would take the meat from people he killed and mix it with pork or beef, or simply use it as it was. And shockingly enough, Joe told the authorities that not a single person could seem to taste the difference between regular burgers and those made with his victims. Joe was given several life sentences to be served continuously and without the possibility of parole. Since his arrest, however, he has repeatedly begged for the death sentence. In an interview, Joe told the press that the only thing he regrets about his killing spree is that he was caught before he had the opportunity to kill the 2 people he really wanted, his ex-girlfriend and the guy she replaced him with. Boyfriend stew. Catherine Knight killed her boyfriend and then turned him into a stew. For this bizarre crime, she became the first Australian woman to receive a life sentence without parole. The terrible murder came after a lifetime of toxic relationships. Catherine's life and relationships were plagued with abuse, violence, and frightening fits of temper. In 1995, she moved in with John Price, the man who she would eventually murder. According to friends and family, she had wanted to marry him, but John declined. When he refused to get married, Catherine turned violent. In 2000, the pair argued, and Catherine tried to stab him in the chest. Price had to get a restraining order against her, but they later reconciled. Price, however, would not let Knight move back into the home in order to protect his two older children. On February 29, 2000, she let herself into John's house, seduced him in the middle of the night, and once he was asleep, she stabbed him 37 times. Catherine then went downstairs, dragging his body behind her. She hung him from a meat hook in the living room, one of the tools of her trade as a butcher, removed his head, then cooked up a meal using his body, along with potato and pumpkin, some squash, and a bit of gravy that she intended to later serve to John's children. After Catherine finished cooking her lover, she took John's headless body and lay down with it in bed. She swallowed a whole bunch of pills and fell asleep. When the police arrived the next morning at the behest of John's co-workers, who were worried because he didn't show up to work, they found Catherine covered in blood, John's body, and the remnants of her macabre meal. She claimed to have no memory of what she had done, but was charged and convicted of murder nonetheless.
The Shigir Idol. The Shigir Idol is the oldest wooden sculpture in the world. It is not only the earliest piece of ritual art ever discovered, it's also one of the most mysterious relics ever found by archaeologists, and it's changing the way we look at prehistory. The Shigir Idol is 12,500 years old, standing 9 feet tall, and is made from larch wood. It was first discovered back in 1890, sticking out from a Russian peat bog. The amazing relic is currently being kept at a rather obscure museum in Russia, deep in the Ural Mountains near the Siberian border. Experts say the Shigir Idol is more mysterious than the Moai statues on Easter Island, and even more baffling than anything left behind by the Egyptians. To put into perspective how old this ancient idol is, it was crafted over 8,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. At this point, you must be wondering who built the idol, but the truth is, it's so old that nobody knows. The idol is a mismatch of geometric patterns and strange human faces, leading archaeologists to believe it probably represented some kind of many-faced god, worshipped by whoever lived here. The truth of the idol is so baffling that scientists didn't even believe a civilization from that long ago could build something like it until it was confirmed as legitimate in 2014. All any scientist can say for sure is that the idol was built by people as the Ice Age was ending and the world was warming up. It was at a point in history when humans started stumbling out of caves and getting together in small groups. This idol was created 4,000 years before the first farmer, indicating that the human need for gathering together and building something special goes back way further than we could even imagine. Göbekli Tepe's death cult. Göbekli Tepe is considered to be the oldest site of worship ever discovered, and over the years, archaeologists have uncovered more and more evidence of shocking ancient practices. It dates back to around 12,000 years ago, or 500 years after the Shigir Idol. It was uncovered by archaeologists in northeastern Turkey, about 10 miles from an ancient settlement called the City of the Prophets. It was the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt who made this monumental discovery. The ruins here, despite being absolutely ancient, still show reliefs of animals carved into the limestone pillars. There are animals like gazelles and snakes, lions, and a whole system of abstract icons. Archaeologists have also found bones underneath the soil here, leading them to believe that Göbekli Tepe had been used for ritual sacrifice. And this brings us to the death cult. Archaeologists have inspected the images on the pillars here and deduced that there was once a cult of death operating inside this ancient structure. Judging by the images of headless men, vultures, and massive scorpions, archaeologists believe whoever built Göbekli Tepe had a fascination with death and definitely performed sacrifices. Images of vultures and scorpions have been found at other religious monuments where early Neolithic death cults operated. But because Göbekli Tepe is the earliest, the beliefs developed by this extremely early society of people most likely started here and may have spread throughout the region, beyond, and even inspired religious beliefs adopted by later cultures like the Egyptians. The Sphinx Mystery. Speaking of the Egyptians, the Great Sphinx stands on the Giza Plateau on the west bank of the Nile River. It was originally constructed in the 4th dynasty to protect the pharaoh Khafre, who was buried beneath one of the 3 huge pyramids around 2500 BC. Geologist Colin Reeder says this may not be the case, and that the Sphinx may actually be quite a bit older. Colin Reeder is part of the Manchester Ancient Egypt Society, so you know he's no stranger when it comes to Egyptology. He says that based on the actual stone that the Sphinx is carved out of, it is significantly older than modern scientists say. He says that it was built before the pharaohs, maybe even before the pyramids, and that its head was redesigned much later to be that of a pharaoh, how we see it today. He says that before the pyramids were built, the ancient Egyptians revered the lion, and so they built a statue depicting a lion. It was that simple. But then, when the pharaohs came along, the lion statue was turned into a sphinx. If true, this would drastically change how scientists view the Great Sphinx and its origin. Graveyard of Giants. Many modern humans are fascinated with the idea of prehistoric giants or abnormally large hominids. In China, archaeologists recently stumbled upon a graveyard of giants over 5,000 years old. It happened while researchers were excavating a settlement from the late Neolithic era in Jiaojia, a small village in the Shandong province. They uncovered the ruins of over 100 houses, along with 20 sacrificial pits and over 200 graves. But the graves are what really caught the attention of archaeologists, as they found the bodies within were over 6 feet tall. While that may not seem like anything special, these individuals would have been way taller than everyone else in the ancient world at the time. One of the graves even contained the body of someone who would have been ridiculously tall at the time, standing upwards of 6 feet 4 inches. According to Fang Hui from the Shandong University, these measurements are only based on the bone structure. When you add in skin and muscle, these people would have stood even taller. To give you some context, the average height of a Neolithic person in Europe was closer to 5 feet back then. By modern standards, most ancient people were basically hobbits. And yet in China, a single group proved to tower above the rest. So why did they grow so tall? One of the theories researchers have is that they had access to better food than other people. Because they ate so much good food, they grew to be extremely tall. Either that, or they were descended from a group of literal giants that have since gone extinct. Ancient woman's genome. The genome of an ancient European woman from 35,000 years ago has just been sequenced, and the results are baffling scientists today. The skull of this prehistoric woman was discovered in southern Romania, in a cave system back in the 1950s. Thanks to modern technology, scientists now know that this mysterious woman was an ancestor of even earlier hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe until the Ice Age ended 10,000 years ago. The reason it's so fascinating is that her genes prove to be extremely diverse, a unique mixture of many different types of people. Scientists thought this type of diversity was lost 80,000 years before today. The scientists found that her DNA shared similarities with both modern humans and Neanderthals. If that sounds a bit confusing, you're not alone. Over 100,000 years ago, modern humans and Neanderthals moving from Africa and into Asia and Europe used to mix their DNA. But scientists thought this stopped happening 80,000 years ago, when humans began fanning out across the globe and Neanderthals were going extinct. It now turns out the Neanderthals and humans were still interbreeding with one another until at least 35,000 years ago, meaning the Neanderthal was around much longer than previously thought. Scientists are now saying that Neanderthals could have existed alongside modern humans until very recently, though how recently is still a mystery. Ancient wine factory. Archaeologists have made a huge breakthrough in Israel with the discovery of a mysterious wine factory. Archaeologists working with the Israel Antiquities Authority were excavating the ruins of the small town of Yavne, just south of Tel Aviv. They found that 1,500 years ago, back when the entire region was controlled by the Byzantines, the city had been something of an industrial complex. They uncovered warehouses, manufacturing facilities, and a very impressive wine factory that would have operated on an industrial scale. Thousands of fragments from clay jars were uncovered in the soil, which were likely being used in the process for brewing wine. This winemaking facility had probably been in operation from sometime between 330 BC and 1453 AD. The city itself was probably a hub for wine, renowned across the region for their impressive product. The exact wine that they brewed was called Gaza wine, and it was shipped all the way from this region to Europe and even Africa. Experts working on the case claim that the facility could have produced around 520,000 gallons, or 2 million liters, in a single year. John Seligman, the lead excavator, says Gaza wine was a trademark of the area, a prestige wine coveted by Egyptians, Greeks, and even the people in southern Italy. However, nobody really knows why the factory was decommissioned, abandoned, and lost beneath the sand for hundreds of years. Would you drink ancient Gaza wine made from this facility if they found a sealed and drinkable bottle? Do you think it would be expensive? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. Ice Age tobacco. A shocking new discovery from Utah has confirmed something that historians have long suspected. As it turns out, human beings have been addicted to using tobacco for at least 12,500 years. Archaeologists working in Utah have finally discovered the earliest use of wild tobacco, significantly older than any other discovery to date. The team that made this discovery is with the Far Western Anthropological Research Group out of Nevada. They found coyote tobacco seeds scattered around a man-made fire pit in the Great Salt Lake Desert. This is just on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. It was in this region over 10,000 years ago that prehistoric humans lived and hunted. They primarily ate ducks, as before this was a desert, it was actually a marsh. But they also made great use of all natural plants, apparently for more than just food. Judging by the sheer number of tobacco seeds found around the fire, researchers have only one theory. They say the ancient Native Americans chewed on the tobacco plant to release nicotine, the highly addictive substance that results in a dopamine high. Why they did this isn't actually much of a mystery. As they were experimenting with different plants, the Native Americans learned that if you chew the tobacco plant, you get a kind of feel-good rush. Amazingly, what began as chewing plants around a fire in the deserts of Utah has continued all the way until now. Only it's extremely frowned upon, very bad for you, and one of the leading causes of death every year. The Great Labyrinth. Archaeologists working in Greece believe they may have just uncovered a mysterious legend from an ancient Greek myth. The discovery was made in a disused stone quarry on the island of Crete. This island is known for hosting one of the oldest civilizations anywhere in the Mediterranean region, the Minoans. It's also the famous location for the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. In the myth, King Minos keeps a powerful minotaur in a labyrinth he had constructed beneath his palace. The hero Theseus eventually shows up and cuts the head off the minotaur. That's kind of the abridged version. Naturally, people in modern times have dismissed the story as nothing but fantasy. But with the new discovery of an elaborate network of underground passages, corridors, and tunnels, it looks like the labyrinth really could have existed. The only issue is that the Great Palace at Knossos, what is believed to be the very real palace of King Minos of the Minoans, is 20 miles away. There is no real way to connect the labyrinth and the palace, nor to prove the labyrinth once housed a minotaur. But considering archaeological evidence proves that a labyrinth really was built on the island thousands of years ago, there is at least a shadow of truth to the myth. Hopefully next, they'll find some minotaur bones. Prehistoric ski. A missing ski was discovered on a Norwegian mountaintop almost a decade ago. Ever since, archaeologists have been searching for its missing counterpart. And against the odds, they may have actually just found it. Archaeologists working with the Secrets of the Ice program back in 2014 were the ones to make this discovery. They literally had to pry the ancient ski out from under the ice. It was still in amazing condition, with its leather straps still intact and even its birch rope binding still usable. 7 years after combing through the ice, this same team of archaeologists finally found the second ski. It was sitting just 16 feet from the first one. and it too was stuck right in the ice under a full foot of fresh snow. And now for the big question. What on earth were these skis being used for 1,300 years ago? Was this some kind of Viking ski resort? Unfortunately, probably not. Instead, the ancient people living in Norway had used skis to easily traverse the ice passes through the mountains. Whoever had been using the skis had either given up and ditched them on the road, suddenly died, or something else even more mysterious. The pig skeleton. In the city of Jerusalem, archaeologists have discovered the complete skeleton of a pig. The pig dates back 2,700 years, to a time when Jewish people were not supposed to be eating pork. As you may already know, eating a pig is forbidden by religious law for people of the Jewish faith. It's actually part of the laws of kashrut, a strict list of foods that Jewish people are allowed to eat or not allowed to eat. Pigs are not on that list, which has made this discovery a little mysterious. The pig was found underneath the ruined foundation of an ancient house, and there were other bones there too, animals like sheep, goats, and fish. Because of the huge variety of animals, researchers say the homeowners must have been from the upper class, but the pig was never actually eaten. Instead, researchers believe that because its entire skeleton was uncovered, it probably died when the roof of the home collapsed. It was only 7 months old, which means these people had been keeping the pig in their house for quite some time. The big mystery here is trying to figure out why. It could be that some ancient Jews didn't take their dietary rules quite so seriously. Rather than stay away from pork forever, they secretly kept pigs in their houses and grew them nice and fat to get some yummy bacon. Or maybe the pig was just a pet. The Styracosaurus. The Styracosaurus is one of the more unusual dinosaurs that ever lived. Its name translates roughly to spiked lizard. It had an extremely impressive crown on its head made of spikes. Picture a triceratops except with significantly more horns. In fact, the Styracosaurus is a relative of the Triceratops, with both of them coming from a family of creatures known as ceratopsian, or horned or frilled dinosaurs. But out of all the ceratopsian monsters, the Styracosaurus was by far the one with the most distinctive skull. It had an extremely long horn over 2 feet long that stuck out of its nose, and its frill, the great plate rising above its eyes, had anywhere from 4 to 6 extra horns. It was a lot of horns for just one animal, with the experts saying it probably had something to do with attracting mates. The dinosaurs with the more impressive head displays had a better chance of pairing up with a female. Besides just having a lot of horns, the Styracosaurus was a heavy beast. It weighed up to 6,000 pounds, though that made it kind of small compared to the Triceratops, which weighed up to 26,000 pounds. This makes sense considering the Styracosaurus lived on Earth about 10 million years before the frilled dinosaurs most people are familiar with, about 75 million years ago. This means it evolved into the more famous Triceratops, heavier and meaner, right before the Triceratops was annihilated by the great asteroid. Longisquama. The Longisquama insignis is one of the strangest reptiles that has ever been discovered by scientists. Even after they found it, they couldn't agree on what kind of creature it was. They first thought it was some kind of animal that lived in the trees, perhaps related to the earliest birds. The reason it's so unique is that it has strange skin appendages on its back that almost look like feathers, but aren't actually feathers. After quite a bit of research, scientists were able to identify the Longisquama as a type of reptile. It lived in the mid-Triassic, 235 million years before today. Its fossils have been found only in the Madigan Formation, which is located in the country of Kyrgyzstan. The remote and secluded location has made it difficult for paleontologists to do much research. However, the creatures they have found here, at least the ones that they have identified and put in the fossil record, have mostly been bizarre reptiles and fish from the Triassic. The entire area was probably a lush forest, but today it's little more than a desert. As for the weird appendages on this strange reptile, they made it look like any ordinary lizard you would see in the jungle today, except with 6 or 7 massive feather-like structures sticking out of its back. They looked like mini hockey sticks, and scientists still can't figure out what they were used for. Modern paleontologists believe these structures could be some kind of bizarre missing link connecting birds and reptiles. But for now, it's kind of a mystery. Carnotaurus. The Carnotaurus was a very strange type of dinosaur known as a theropod, and believe it or not, there has only been one specimen uncovered anywhere on the planet. But despite there only being a single skeleton ever found of this creature, it was discovered in such great condition that scientists were able to recreate what it looked like. Scientists even know that it had scaly skin and absolutely no feathers. The weirdest part about the Carnotaurus is that it had teeny tiny forelimbs. Think about the T-Rex and its alleged tiny little arms. Well, the Carnotaurus's arms were even tinier. They were literally useless, like if your hands grew out of your armpits with nothing in the middle. It could use them for pretty much nothing, which has boggled scientists who can't figure out why it had arms at all if it couldn't use them. The single specimen of the Carnotaurus had some of its skin still preserved, and with it, scientists were able to find out a lot about the monster. Dr. Phil Bell from the University of New England likened the creature's flesh to that of the thorny devil in Australia. It was completely covered in scales, with small conical studs. It would have been extremely bumpy to touch, and may even have cut your hand. Eternal sleeping dinosaur. 125 million years ago, a pair of dinosaurs fell asleep inside of an underground burrow. They fell asleep and never woke up, as they were buried alive after a volcanic eruption. They then remained undiscovered, sleeping peacefully until paleontologists in China dug them up. They found these two creatures in pristine condition, with each dino being about 4 feet long. They were given an extremely long name in Chinese, and it translates roughly to the eternal sleeper. The two specimens can be found today at the Paleontological Museum of Liaoning, in the same province where they were originally discovered. A team of researchers from Argentina and Belgium recently took great interest in the eternal sleepers and did a bit of investigating. As it turns out, they were very unique in the world of dinosaurs. They may have been an early type of herbivore that walked on 2 legs, ran extremely quickly, and burrowed deep in the earth. This is strange because most dinosaurs weren't really burrowing animals. They preferred to lumber around on land, throwing their weight around. These critters were quite different. Senior researcher Pascal Godefroy even compared them to rabbits. But perhaps what's really interesting is that there may have been significantly more critters just like these. It's just that their fossils have never been found. Because of the rare circumstance in which the two dinos were preserved in their underground nests, they have been some of the only burrowing creatures ever uncovered from the days of the dinosaurs. Erythrosuchus. The Erythrosuchus was one of the biggest predators in South Africa during the Middle Triassic. And while this creature is certainly related to the dinosaurs, it was its own unique type of animal called an archosauriform reptile. It was a carnivore that could grow 15 feet long, huge and powerful, but quite slow and cumbersome. It had thick muscles, thick bones, and trudged slowly over land. It couldn't even walk very fast. But this wasn't a big problem millions of years ago because the herbivores couldn't move very quickly either. It was basically a bunch of oversized carnivores hobbling after oversized plant eaters. Perhaps the weirdest part about the Erythrosuchus is simply the way it looked. Imagine a huge crocodile except with the head of a dinosaur. That's basically what we're talking about here. A freak of nature with dinosaur teeth and an enormous body of a huge reptile. Unfortunately, not much is known about the behavior of this huge beast. Only a handful of skeletons have ever been found, and none of them have been complete. The best guess scientists have is that it ambushed its prey. It probably hung out near rivers and in the bushes, where it could chomp on other animals when they strolled by. What's your favorite dinosaur? Do you wish that they were still around? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about prehistoric creatures. Hongyu Chowie. The bizarre fossil of the prehistoric fish called Hongyu Chowie may just be changing our understanding of how creatures moved from the sea to the land. This curious fish is one of the only fish ever discovered that shares several key features with land animals. And yet, all the same, scientists say it's only slightly related to land animals, and so it still doesn't paint a complete picture. As you may already know, it was about 360 million years ago when a group of fish flopped out of the water, grew 4 legs, and started wandering around on land. These 4-legged fish turned into reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and ultimately humans. But there are some serious links missing between fish and reptiles, and the Hongyu Chowie is just one piece of a larger puzzle. First of all, this fish lived somewhere between 370 and 360 million years ago. It was discovered in 2002 in China by researchers with the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. Ever since, researchers have been trying to figure out where the fish fits into the family tree. The problem is that the fish had some strange features, such as a shoulder girdle, something some of the earliest land animals had. It also had special gill support, a biological feature of animals as they transitioned away from using gills. Still, the fish didn't actually have any legs. Scientists have still never found the exact animal that was in the middle of the transition, sprouting legs to crawl out of the water. The Pentaceratops. The Pentaceratops was kind of like the Triceratops. Its name means five-horned face, whereas the Triceratops means three-horned face. Get it? The weirdest part is that both creatures really only had three main horns. Each prehistoric beast had a pair of horns over its eyes, with a smaller one on the end of its nose. In the case of the Pentaceratops, it had two very small outgrowths on its cheekbones, technically meaning it had 5 horns instead of 3. But the biggest difference between the Pentaceratops and the other dinosaurs of its kind was just how massive its head was. It had one of the largest skulls of any dinosaur that has ever lived on the planet. Get ready to have your mind blown, because the Pentaceratops had a head on average of 10 feet in length. Its head was absolutely gigantic. It also ruled the area of what is today New Mexico at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 75 million years ago. There were other types of horn-faced dinosaurs in Mexico, but the Pentaceratops was so big and so menacing that it ruled most of the American Southwest. If you want to know why this dinosaur had such a huge head, scientists say it probably had something to do with sexual selection. At some point, the ornaments, meaning horns on their heads, became so attractive to females that dinosaurs with the bigger heads and more shapely horns simply bred far more often. This meant that the males with the larger heads had babies with equally large heads, passing the gene along until all of them had ridiculously large noggins. The crab platypus. One of the weirdest things that ever existed is something called a crab platypus. It was a horrible thing with a hodgepodge of seemingly random body parts. And yet despite this, it was only the size of a quarter. It was absolutely tiny and technically a crab. But it lived 95 million years ago and was on an offshoot branch stemming from the crab family tree. In other words, it was an outcast. Javier Luque from Yale University called its discovery one of the most exciting fossil finds of the past decade. The crab platypus was found in Colombia in 2005, but others have since been dug up in places like Wyoming and Morocco. The little crab lived all over the world, and here's why it was so weird. It had giant eyes but no eye sockets. It had bent claws, mouth parts that looked like shrimp legs, and finally a tail just about as long as its body. To the casual observer, it wasn't much of a crab at all. Scientists still don't know what happened to it or why it deviated so far from the rest of the crabs, like the ones we still have today. Dolocaris. The Dolocaris was an invertebrate that lived during the Jurassic period. It also happened to look like a miniature alien spacecraft. It had a small body, giant eyeballs, and weird grappling appendages that you'd expect to see dropping from some kind of alien vessel floating through space. But the biggest mystery is that scientists can't properly identify it. Some say it's closely related to the mantis shrimp. Some say it's related to worm-like crustaceans that live in aquatic caves. But nobody really knows the truth. Let's talk about its huge eyes for a minute. The Dolocaris had eyes that took up about a quarter of its body length. Researchers say each eyeball probably had about 18,000 lenses. It was able to see extraordinarily well, which probably would have made it an apex predator. It could have easily watched for any kind of movement going on around it, then flung out its long appendages to snag prey. This means the Dolocaris most likely spent the majority of its time floating through the darkest parts of the ocean, using its huge eyeballs to constantly search for food. The Albertosaurus. The Albertosaurus is the lesser-known cousin of the T-Rex, a truly strange and monstrous creature that has an extensive fossil record. It's not as popular as the T-Rex, but so many bones have been found in the Canadian province of Alberta belonging to this ancient beast that scientists know a lot about it. First of all, it was a type of tyrannosaur, just like the T-Rex. but it was half of the more popular dino size, coming in at only 30 feet from the top of its head to the tip of its tail. It also only weighed about 4,000 pounds. But even though the Albertosaurus was so small, it was still a killing machine. What it lacked in size, it made up with in speed and agility. It was way faster than the T-Rex, plus it may have hunted in packs. Since paleontologists have discovered so many specimens in the same spot, they believe the Albertosaurus lived in small groups as social animals. The Albertosaurus was the prehistoric version of the modern wolf. So what exactly did these dinosaurs hunt while they were marauding across the Canadian countryside in packs? Their favorite animals to eat were duck-billed dinosaurs such as the Edmontosaurus, named after the city of Edmonton, and the Lambeosaurus. Their hunting was actually great for the ecosystem, since they chose the most vulnerable animals, getting rid of sick, old, and juvenile. Granite head of Caesarion. Ptolemy XV Caesar, who went by the nickname Caesarion, was Egypt's last pharaoh and Cleopatra's illegitimate son with Julius Caesar. He reigned alongside his mother until she committed suicide in 30 BC, and continued ruling on his own until the Roman Emperor Octavian had him put to death, not very long after. He was quite the threat to his rule, and there was no way Octavian was going to let him live. There are very few surviving images of Caesarion since most of them were destroyed. One of these depictions came in the form of an enormous granite head that was pulled from the harbor of Alexandria in 1997. Dating back to the 1st century BC, it was found in a section of the ancient city that was submerged by earthquakes and tidal waves. The head was likely once part of a complete statue of the ruler. Alexandria's underwater ruins consist of numerous other fascinating artifacts, including a marble head of the Roman princess Antonia Minor, a sphinx, several shipwrecks, and much, much more. SS Thistlegorm vehicles. During World War II, German bombers struck a British merchant navy ship called the SS Thistlegorm, causing it to sink to the bottom of the Red Sea. The vessel had been built just a year earlier and had only completed 3 successful voyages. Thistlegorm carried steel rails, aircraft parts, grain, rum, and other cargo throughout her short-lived career. She traveled to the US, Argentina, and the West Indies. The vessel departed Glasgow, Scotland for Alexandria, Egypt in 1941, loaded with armored vehicles, motorcycles, trucks, ammo, guns, radio equipment, aircraft and railway parts, and 2 train locomotives. A crash in the Suez Canal stopped Thistlegorm from passing through, so the ship docked at a safe anchorage off the Egyptian coast. The Germans suspected that Allied troops were hiding on the vessel, so they dispatched 2 bombers to find and destroy it. 2 bombs struck the ship, causing some of its ammunition cargo to explode. 9 people died as Thistlegorm sank to her watery grave. French explorer Jacques Cousteau rediscovered the site during the 1950s. It was soon forgotten about until the early 1990s, when the coastal city of Sharm el-Sheikh opened it to divers. The section that was blown off the 420-foot-long ship during the attack created a convenient opening that visitors can use for easy access to the inside, which still contains most of the cargo, including the vehicles. The longest creature ever. Last year, a team of researchers encountered what they believe might be the longest creature ever discovered while surveying the seafloor off Western Australia. Known as a siphonophore, they described it as an enormous spiral floating in the water column. Scientists admitted that they didn't know exactly how long the otherworldly organism is. They estimated that its outer ring measured nearly 155 feet and said that they were in the process of determining its entire length. At the time, the team believed that the siphonophore was at least 390 feet long. They promised to update the world once they know for sure. If their estimate is correct, the creature would surpass the lion's mane jellyfish as the world's longest marine animal. The current record holder is 120 feet long. The siphonophore also stands to supersede the 180-foot-long ribbon worm, which is the world's longest land animal. Siphonophores are predatory deep-sea dwellers made up of small clones that work together as one organism. They take on a rope-like appearance and resemble jellyfish, but are more closely related to corals and anemones. Lead researcher Nerida Wilson told CBC that the clones somehow communicate with one another to harmoniously take on different roles, like feeding and reproduction. Scientists admittedly know very little about siphonophores and don't even know how they reach such enormous lengths. Severed hands. While working in Russia's Far East near the Chinese border in October 2018, some fishermen found a sack containing 54 severed human hands, along with medical bandages and surgical shoe covers. The alarmed gentleman called the local police, who determined through fingerprints that the hands belonged to at least 27 different people. In the meantime, rumors flew like wildfire, with some speculating that the hands were cut off as a punishment for theft. Police theorized that the severed appendages were amputated limbs from a medical facility that had been disposed of improperly, but they were left scratching their heads when they realized that many of the people the hands belonged to had had both hands cut off. Usually a person only needs one hand amputated. It's possible that the hands were cut off of corpses to retain fingerprint information after burial, a practice that is reportedly somewhat common in Russia, but the story remains unclear. The hands were not connected to any suspected criminal activity, and the Russian government offered little explanation beyond stating that the limbs came from a forensic lab and not to worry about it. They always say that. Underwater Jesus. You may be surprised to learn that there are numerous submerged statues of Jesus Christ throughout the world. One, known as the Christ of the Abyss, sits in the waters off San Frutuoso, Italy. Made by sculptor Guido Galletti, it was placed in the Mediterranean Sea in 1954 as a tribute to Dario Gonzat, the first Italian to use scuba gear. The bronze likeness sits 56 feet below the water's surface. Another famous underwater Jesus sculpture can be found off the Florida Keys in John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park. Dubbed the Christ of the Deep, the 4,000-pound barnacle-covered statue was created by Guido Galletti, the same sculptor who made the Christ of the Abyss in Italy. It was installed in the waters off Key Largo in 1965. It's the third of a series of Jesus statues that Galletti has placed underwater. The second sculpture was placed along the coastline of St. George's, Granada in 1961. It was a gift to the Navy of Genoa for their diligent efforts to rescue the crew of the MV Bianca C, an Italian vessel that was destroyed in a fire. Lake Michigan is home to the only underwater crucifix in the world. Measuring 11 feet tall, it features a nearly life-sized figure of Jesus, but it wasn't created by Galletti unlike the other Jesus statues. In 1955, a teenage boy died in a car accident in the town of Bad Axe, Michigan. His grief-stricken family bought the crucifix as a memorial to the teen, but it broke during shipping, so they refused to take it. In 1962, a local diving club in the Little Traverse Bay gave the statue a home at the bottom of the lake in memory of a diver who died nearby. Ancient chicken egg. While excavating a watery pit in Buckinghamshire, England in 2016, scientists discovered 4 ancient chicken eggs. They only managed to retrieve one without breaking it. It was estimated to be around 1,700 years old, making it the only complete egg dating back to Roman-era Britain. The 3 eggs that broke released what the team later described as a putrid stench. After sitting around for over a millennium, I can imagine. Archaeologists uncovered other rare artifacts, including leather shoes, wooden tools, and a basket made from oak and willow. People threw items into the pit for good luck from the 3rd century onward. It functioned as an ancient wishing well of sorts, according to senior project manager Edward Biddulph, who spoke with the BBC. He speculated that the eggs may have been a food offering that was thrown into the pit during a funeral. Apollo 11 rocket engines. The 1969 Apollo 11 mission is famous for putting a man on the moon for the first time. After launching on July 16th of that year, it deposited its Saturn V F1 rocket engines into the Atlantic Ocean. 2 of them were found in 2012, courtesy of a team from Bezos Expeditions, an exploration company owned by Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. They found the rocket engines using deep-sea sonar, then used remotely operated vehicles to gain a closer look. The crew found a tangled and time-worn mess of parts on the sea floor, 14,000 feet below the water's surface. There was only one way to tell how intact the parts were: by removing them from the water. In a statement, Bezos explained that the rocket engines had hit the surface at high velocity before spending over 40 years in highly corrosive salt water. At the same time, he said they are made of tough stuff, so we'll see. Because 67 Saturn V F1 engines were launched between 1967 and 1973, the team had to verify that the pair were actually from Apollo 11. They confirmed this several months later by examining the part's extremely worn and barely detectable serial number. Mystifying blob. Several years ago, divers encountered a huge, unexplainable jelly-like orb off the western coast of Norway. It measured over 3 feet wide and had a dark streak through the center. Nearly 100 similar sightings have been reported near Norway and in the Mediterranean Sea since 1985. Until recently, scientists were just as perplexed as anyone else when it came to identifying the bizarre translucent blobs. A DNA analysis finally put the mystery to rest last year, when researchers identified the orbs as rarely seen egg sacs belonging to the short-fin squid. The species is common throughout the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. Each orb can hold hundreds or even thousands of eggs, which sit suspended in a slowly dissolving mucus. Scientists have known about the short-fin squid for over 180 years, but this was the first time that they identified the species' eggs in the wild. They also observed squid embryos throughout 4 different stages of development and watched the changes in the sac as the eggs matured. The large orbs keep the creature's eggs buoyant, protecting the unborn young from predators along the sea floor. Mystery solved. A forest. Off the Alabama coast in the Gulf of Mexico, there is a 60,000-year-old cypress forest that once stood on dry land. The trees sprouted along the banks of a river at around the same time ancient humans are believed to have started migrating out of Africa. Sea levels rose, eventually engulfing the entire forest. It sat undisturbed until 2004, when Hurricane Ivan disturbed the seabed, revealing its presence in modern-day Mobile Bay. Last year, scientists announced that the trees contain materials that might be useful in the development of certain life-saving medicines. This realization came after divers retrieved samples of the wood as part of a NOAA-funded expedition. Divers found that the trees were remarkably well preserved after spending years buried in sediment that prevented oxygen from reaching them and causing them to decay. Experts removed over 300 organisms from the wood, including a previously unknown species of shipworm that produces over 100 types of bacteria. Many of the bacteria are new to science and are undergoing DNA analysis to determine their potential medical uses in cancer-fighting and pain medications. According to a NOAA statement, in the past, at least one shipworm species has shown promise as a possible antibiotic against parasitic worm infections. The wood may also prove to be useful in paper products, renewable fuel, chemicals, animal feed, and more. Vintage Bugatti. In 2009, a 1925 Bugatti Type 22 Brescia Roadster was found at the bottom of Lake Maggiore along the border of Italy and Switzerland. After sitting underwater for 73 years, it was damaged and heavily rusted. Despite this, the car sold at auction for around $400,000. But how did it get to the bottom of the lake in the first place? According to records, the car was registered to a French address when it ended up in Lake Maggiore in 1935. Grand Prix driver René Dreyfus had reportedly lost it to Swiss playboy Adalbert Baudet during a drunken poker game the previous year. Adalbert allegedly tried to bring the car into Switzerland, but didn't want to pay the hefty import taxes that came with it. So he told the authorities to do whatever they wanted with it, and they supposedly handled the matter by rolling the car into the lake. This might sound crazy, but at the time, the vehicle wasn't worth much. It was rediscovered in 1967 by a diver named Hugo Pillon. Over 40 years later, a local dive club finally rescued it with plans to sell it and put the proceeds towards a charity that combats youth violence. Peter Mullen, who owns the Mullen Automotive Museum in California, bought the Bugatti and put it on display there. He did not restore it, but instead left it as is, placing it in an exhibit that recreates the feel of being at the bottom of a lake. A strip club. While researching off the Israeli coast several years ago, marine biologist Gil Koplovitz came across a submerged nightlife venue that was no longer in business. He released perplexing images of the abandoned establishment in 2013. Located in Eilat, the business originally opened as a restaurant called the Red Sea Star. It was reportedly later repurposed as an erotic dancing venue, aka a strip club, called Nymphis Show Bar. The building's entrance is above water. Speaking with the Huffington Post, Koplovitz explained that visitors crossed a 230-foot bridge and then descended a flight of stairs to get inside. He said he was unsure when the strip joint closed its doors. Koplovitz snapped photos of the former club's interior through the resting venue's glass windows. The images show a stripper pole that functioned as a centerpiece. It was once surrounded by tables and chairs that have since been removed. Curiously, very little information is available online about the Nymphis Show Bar, other than the details Koplovitz offered after conducting his own investigation. It may have been the only underwater strip club that ever existed. Thanks for watching! What's the craziest thing that you've seen underwater? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you later! Bye!